Okay, everybody, I know the output on the channel has been a little bit slow, but that's because I'm trying to get settled here in the pillbox. But I have a special treat. Today we've got a double feature, if you will. The Tale of Two Time Machines. Now, I've mentioned before in videos that we can learn a lot from older sci-fi movies and how they view the future. What the generations before were warning us about in these films. But something I have found that can be even more instructive is if you can find a film that is, I don't know, say half a century old, and analyze its view of the future side by side with a more contemporary remake of that same film from 50 years later. What sorts of things would the filmmakers change? Not just the view of the future, but the characters or maybe even key elements of the story. So, with this in mind, I watched a film titled, coincidentally enough, The Time Machine, based on the sci-fi classic by H.G. Wells, both the version from 1960 and the version produced in 2002. Both movies are based on a book written now over 100 years ago, in 1895. But both films depart significantly enough from the original story to where it's pretty much irrelevant. So for this video, I'm going to ignore the book for the most part and simply take a look at how the same basic story was presented to audiences 50 years apart. So let's begin with the film released by MGM in 1960, directed by George Pal. The Time Machine begins in London on New Year's Eve in 1899, around the time the original book was released. Four different distinguished gentlemen are gathered around a table in a room with a peculiar amount of clocks. They all chime at once as the hour strikes 8, and then the men look annoyed as if they're just tolerating the eccentric owner of the clocks, but don't approve of their existence. They also don't approve of this eccentric person's absence. The maid enters the room, and one of the men delivers one of my favorite lines of the film, the first indication that this screenplay wasn't written by SJWs.
Well, speak up. What is it, woman?
The maid has a note, and the note says that if their host, George, isn't there by 8 o'clock, that they should begin dinner without him. She also tells the group that he has been gone for several days. The group gathers around the table and is about to start dinner when George, presumably, bounds into the room looking tattered and wounded. The men are shocked by his sudden appearance and by, well, his appearance generally. They give him a drink and ask him to explain what's happened to him. He begins his story and we flash back to about a week prior. The same men are in the same room. George has invited them there to witness an experiment. He has built what he says is a time machine. He has a miniature version of the real thing, and he would like them to see it operated for the first time. They all seem skeptical, even after he powers up the machine and tells them it's going to launch into the future, and they watch as it disappears. The only one who seems to believe him is his best friend. The rest are baffled and convinced that it must have been some kind of parlor trick. We can see that some things never change, however, when one of the men suggests that if what he says is true, that he should then sell this technology to the military and use it as a weapon. He mentions the war in South Africa against the Boer and suggests that it could help England win the war. 3 of the gentlemen leave, but his best friend, David, remains to ask him, why is he so obsessed with time? George says something that many of us can relate to. He says he feels he was born in the wrong time. The difference, however, is that when questioned if George would like to go back into the past, George scoffs at the idea and says he would only want to go to the future. I find this pretty fascinating because if you think about modern time travel fiction like the baby boomers created, Back to the Future or Quantum Leap, the first thing the writers wish to explore is the past. It's 180 degrees out of phase with H.G. Wells, who was writing The Time Machine just before the beginning of a new century in 1895, but that's really not too different than the baby boomers who were writing their tales in the 1980s before the year 2000. H.G. Wells, however, was so excited to see what the future would be like. He seemed to think that it must hold more promise than the past. And in this version of the time machine, released in 1960, the past is never even considered. David implores George to destroy the time machine. He says, if it does what he says it does, that it's unnatural, and that he shouldn't attempt to defy the laws of providence. This is another attitude that is completely out of phase with the modern world. Technology keeps progressing because there's a sense that it must progress. There seems to be a complete lack of consideration for what effect these new technologies might have on mankind today, to the extent that if a technology is described as disruptive, that's praise. George tells David to come to dinner in 1 week's time and to invite the others. David then leaves to spend the rest of the new year with his wife and new baby, and George, his mind made up, goes to his lab where the full-scale version of the time machine lays in wait. He sits in the time machine and then activates it by pushing the lever forward. In the version of the time machine produced by DreamWorks, directed by Simon Wells and Gore Verbinski, the setup is significantly different, almost unrecognizable, not only from the 1960 version of the film, but from the book as well. In this version, George, who has a different name, but who I'll just refer to as George to keep things simple and not confusing, is an absent-minded, eccentric professor. His friend comes to the school where he works and reminds him that his girlfriend Emma, a character that doesn't even exist in the book or in the other film, is supposed to meet him in the park. They leave the school, and George begins to lecture his friend about how he needs to change the world, how everyone is too similar. They all wear the same bowler hats, and he wants to improve things with diversity. The revolutionary spirit is strong with this version of George. He complains that the school is too conservative. One exchange is particularly enlightening. George's friend says he wants his students to be prepared for the realities of the world, to which George replies, well, I don't. I want them to run down the street and knock off every bowler hat they see. When the two get to George's home, we discover that the same maid is working there, Mrs. Watchett, but of course, this is 2002, so she is spicy and full of attitude and condescension, and seems merely to tolerate the men rather than to dutifully serve them like her 1960 counterpart. The filmmakers throw in some jokes about George inventing things like the electric toothbrush, and for no reason other than to promote the myth of Einstein, throw in a few lines about how George can see the brilliance of this young Jewish patent clerk. He runs to the park to meet his girlfriend, who is patiently waiting for him, and after proposing to his love, the two are mugged. Emma, the invention of the 2002 filmmakers, is shot and killed in the exchange, and George is devastated. George becomes obsessed with time, and not just with the future like the 1960 version of himself or the 1895 version of himself, but with the past. He builds the time machine, and instead of testing it with his friends, like in the 1960 version, he uses it to go back in time, back into the past to try to save Emma. He runs to the park to prevent Emma from being shot, and just as he thinks that he's saved her, she's killed in a freak accident. And George, for some reason, comes to the conclusion that no matter how many times he went back in time, he would never be able to save her, that she would just be killed in some other way because that is her fate. The filmmakers never really explain why George is so sure of this just after one try, but he is, and now angry with the world that is resisting his attempts to change it, he will leave this world and go to the future. So now we're caught up with the 1960 version. 1960 George activates the time machine by pushing the lever forward. He watches as the sun flies overhead like time-lapse video, and the mannequin across the street changes the style of clothing. After traveling a few years, he decides to stop the time machine and go out and have a look at things. His house is now boarded up, so he breaks out and walks across the street. And that's when he sees who he thinks is his friend David. But it turns out, of course, because it's been several years, it's not David, it's David's son, now grown up. George discovers that David has actually died in World War I, but not before he made sure to preserve George's estate in a trust, which explains why nobody is living in George's house. I want to point something out here. I haven't read the book since I was like 12, so I don't remember really much of anything other than the basic storyline. And I'm not sure if George's friendship was such a key feature of the original story. But this film does a really good job of showing a strong male bond between George and David. They respect each other. There's a masculine fondness between them that doesn't really exist in movies today. Certainly there are buddy movies, which are becoming less and less frequent and kind of have devolved into the metrosexual bromance genre of films. But in 1960, The Telling of the Time Machine, even though it's not terribly important to the story, it really highlights how two men who have chosen completely different paths in life can still have a brotherly bond that stands up to the test of time, in this case, literally. This will be reiterated later in the film as well, but George is truly touched by his friend's gesture and the lengths that he went to in order to preserve his home in his absence, and also has an immediate fondness for his friend's son, who really has no idea who George is. After his chat, George heads back to the time machine and removes the boards from his window so he can watch his familiar friend, the mannequin, change over time. If only the filmmakers had access to what really became of women's fashion in the future. In the 2002 version of The Time Machine, George also decides to go into the future. He watches as his laboratory changes. The difference is he has no friendship with David, so his estate is not preserved, so it changes the different buildings. He does, however, have a view of the mannequins, so he watches them in the shop across the street and watches as the dresses get shorter and shorter and more revealing. As he watches the time changes, he accidentally drops his locket with the picture of Emma, and it's lost forever in time. As he goes further and further into the future, things start to change dramatically, and he decides to stop the time machine when he sees an animated billboard declaring that the future is now. In this version, George has traveled all the way to the year 2030. It's the kind of city that you see in Star Trek movies, a multicultural utopia. George walks to a nearby library and meets an AI computer of color that has access to all the world's information. He's impressed but disappointed to find that the AI considers time travel fiction. So after asking the AI a couple questions about time travel, he realizes it's kind of a lost cause and decides to go back to his time machine. In the parallel universe of the 1960 version, George, who has already returned to the time machine, once again activates it, and he watches as World War II rages on outside of the window. Eventually, his laboratory is destroyed by a German rocket. He watches as the buildings are rebuilt, and then he stops in 1966. Which, for the original audience of the film, you have to remember this is only 6 years into the future. The next scene is a perfect illustration of how the West was kept in constant fear of an atomic bomb coming from the Soviets. This fear lasted for decades. But remember, this movie was presenting the idea to the theater audience that what we're about to see was a likely scenario for just 6 years into the future. These were the kinds of themes and images that would continue on all the way through to the 90s. So George stops the time machine and he hears air raid sirens. When I was a kid, and we're talking like in the late 80s, I lived near an Air Force base on the West Coast, and even in the late 80s, they performed drills, air raid sirens. I could hear them in my bedroom. I mean, it was kind of terrifying at first, but slowly it just became something that we expected. You know, kind of the same way we expected it when our school teachers would tell us to get under our desk and the bell would just continuously ring outside the classroom. We would do these drills all the time. And the filmmakers of this version of the time machine are acutely aware of the psychological impact that these constant drills with ever-present threats of annihilation had on the public. George gets out of the time machine and finds people running to the nearest fallout shelter. As an aside, in the panic, it's easy to miss that there's a plaque that commemorates David's dedication to his best friend George in his estate, which is now a public park where the laboratory once stood. So it's just a little detail, but again, it's just reiterating the friendship between George and David. George encounters an elderly man running for the shelter who urges George to come with him or risk being vaporized by the incoming attack. After a moment, George realizes that he's once again speaking to David's son, who slowly begins to recall their meeting back in 1917. This must be his father's old friend, George the time traveler. But the attack is imminent, and David's son retreats to the shelter, warning him that he's got to get to safety. But George is confused. He watches in horror as London suffers a direct hit. Not only is the city completely devastated by the blast, but something else that's common in these movies that we're always warning of, the existential threat of nuclear war. Mother Earth responds in anger at man's destructive ways and unleashes her fury. Massive volcanic eruptions take place all around the world and swallow up civilization with hot lava. George managed to escape just in time, but his time machine ends up being covered in lava, so he's forced to travel at extreme speeds through time and wait for the newly formed rock around the time machine to eventually erode away. So while that's going on, we'll go back to the parallel universe in 2002. George in this version has traveled not to 1966, but to 2037, so 7 years beyond the moment that he was previously in the futuristic city. The city is destroyed, but in this version of reality, it's not war that has brought the destruction. When George encounters men who are trying to bring him to a shelter, he discovers that the moon is breaking apart thanks to the unchecked technological advancements of man. Now, I was kind of amused by the idea for a number of reasons. It seems like the filmmakers were kind of looking for a way to show that man's assault on nature with technology would be our undoing. But at the time, they recognized that in 2002, there was like this never-ending stream of movies telling the public that global warming was going to be the end of the world and destroy the earth. And I think they just wanted to come up with something a little bit outside of the box. However, I think they kind of strayed too far outside of the box, because without the moon, there's no tides. And without the tides, there's no life on Earth. So in this reality, if you destroy the moon, you kind of effectively end life on Earth. I also find it interesting that in this film, they went to this extreme, this far-fetched idea to avoid the obvious scenario of the war that was used in the 1960s. That civilization would be destroyed by infighting by their own hands. It's almost as if the filmmakers, having given the audience a taste of the multicultural utopia, they didn't have a choice. They had to make them believe that once that was achieved, that war was impossible. It was inconceivable. It was the end of history. Everyone was living side by side in harmony. It was preposterous to think that anything could ever go wrong, or that peoplekind would have anything to fight about ever again. So instead, they blew up the moon. At any rate, so both Georges now are traveling further and further into the future. Thousands and thousands of years go by, and they both, for lack of a better term, crash their time machines and are knocked unconscious. Both arriving in the same year, I think the year 80,000 or something like that, but very, very different realities. 1960 George finds himself in a paradise-like landscape with strange temple structures. He explores the strange land and some of the strange buildings, and eventually he comes across a group of people in what looks like the Garden of Eden. The filmmakers in 1960, it would seem, were extremely optimistic about European birth rates. Everyone has blonde hair and blue eyes. They're all laughing and enjoying themselves. They don't have a care in the world. It's paradise. But the idyllic scene is interrupted when George hears a woman screaming for help. And to George's surprise, nobody reacts to her screams. He's confused when he sees this woman drowning in the river, but nobody's lifting a finger to save her. Eventually, he decides he can't wait any longer, and he rushes into the water to save the woman. But then once she's safely on the shore, she just wanders away as if nothing happened. And nobody seems to even react to George's sudden appearance. This is the future that the filmmakers envisioned in 1960. Self-interested, pampered young people, self-absorbed, too busy enjoying themselves to bother with helping each other. A metaphor for the baby boomers that really couldn't be any more obvious. Growing up in this era of plenty with hedonistic lifestyles that never demanded that they look outside of themselves and do anything for the group. Individuals gifted with a paradise where they wanted for nothing and were only interested in peace and love within their own sphere of existence. It's a world filled with spoiled children with glazed over eyes. George follows these bizarre people to one of the buildings that he had explored previously. The woman that he saved walks up and brings him his coat back and asks, genuinely confused, why he saved her. George is also confused and asks, well, why nobody seems curious about who he is, why no one tried to save her. Don't you worry about where I came from? But she doesn't even seem to understand any of his questions. George finds out that her name is Weena, and that these people are called the Eloi. Weena invites George to join the rest of the group for dinner. And so he goes to eat dinner with her friends that had just moments ago watched her as she was drowning. George tries to make conversation. He expects them to at least be kind of interested in the fact that he's a time traveler from tens of thousands of years ago and has suddenly just appeared among them out of nowhere, but none of them care at all. They all just eat their food and stare blankly. After trying desperately to get information from these people, he's told that they have no government, no laws, the food and their clothing is just magically provided for them. It really is the baby boomer paradise. Frustrated that he can't seem to get any details out of these disinterested people, he asks if they have any books, and one of the Eloi tells him that yes, they do have books, and he takes them to go see the books. Meanwhile, in the 2002 version, we find a radically different version of the future. In 2002, you can't have a man heroically saving a woman. That's sexist. So like everything else in this inverted future we live in today, the roles have been reversed. In 2002, George is saved and nursed back to health by Weena, who in this version of reality just happens to be a black single mom with an androgynous son. The filmmakers in 2002, it would seem, had more current data on European birth rates, and perhaps were even aware of some things to come. They showed the audience the future they envisioned. The multicultural future where the Eloi lived in this version could be described as a cross between Wakanda and the Ewok village from Star Wars. Hollywood-produced African music that sounds like it belongs on the Lion King soundtrack plays in the background, and because George, of course, is a white male in this diverse community, even though he's the inventor of the world's only time machine in existence, he's a buffoon. The noble savages tolerate him and humor him as if he's the village idiot, and of course it's George that has much to learn from them, not the other way around, as we see in the 1960 version of the film. In the 1960 version of the film, George is shown where the Eloi keep the books, and the books have rotted away to dust. He's furious that they have allowed the knowledge of ages to just vanish. He goes back to the group and he shouts at them, trying to wake them up from their stupor, and he implores them to try to be curious and to respect the civilizations that came before them. It's actually pretty eerie to watch this actor who came from the so-called greatest generation shouting at a room full of baby boomers, berating them as they ignore him, confounded that they have allowed all this knowledge of their ancestors to dissolve and slip away. He tells them that he's so disgusted that he's going to go back to his own time, and he's not even going to bother telling his friends about the Eloi because their existence is that meaningless. He storms back to his time machine just completely fed up and in a rage, but he finds out that his time machine has been taken inside one of the temple structures. While trying to break in, he's interrupted by Weena, who tells him that there are two people in this land. There are the Eloi, but there's also the Morlocks. The Morlocks provide the food, the safety, the shelter for the Eloi, but the Eloi must obey. And once again, we see social commentary in the 1960 version of the film that's completely rewritten and hidden from the audiences in 2002. The world consists of two groups, this movie is saying. The clueless, selfish people that won't lift a finger to help each other, won't band together into groups for safety and for strength. They're all just separate individuals who only care about their own desires and obeys the ruling class that provides their bread unquestioningly. There are only the rulers and the ruled has to obey so they don't jeopardize their access to, as Owen might say, and quite literally in this movie, their lollipops and their fancy pants. The existence of the Eloi is best summed up when George says to Weena, "Don't you ever think about the past?" And Weena says, "There is no past." To which George says, "Don't you ever wonder about the future?" And Weena says, "There is no future." And that's because the Eloi live only in the now. They have no concept of who or what came before them, no care for or who or what will come after them. They feel no responsibility, no duty. They have no honor, only masters. When the increasingly black-pilled George realizes this, he decides to give the audience a white pill and says, "We've had our dark ages before, and this is simply another one of them. All you need is someone to show you the way out." The next day, George and Weena are still trying to find their way inside the temple so George can get his time machine. That's when Weena tells George that there are some magic rings that tell him stories from the past if he spins them on this table. So George gathers up the rings and spins them on the table, one by one, and they kind of give him a brief history of how the Eloi and the Morlocks came to be. They originated as one people, and the Morlocks decided to live beneath the ground in the darkness, and they somehow managed to rule over the Eloi who had decided to stay in the light and on the surface of the planet. And once the Morlocks came to rule over the Eloi, they began to breed them like cattle. Armed with this new alarming information, George is now twice as determined to get inside the Morlock temple. Not only does he want to get his time machine, but he wants to know what the Morlocks do with the Eloi. Meanwhile, in the 2002 parallel universe, things continue to be inverted. It's Weena, the strong, powerful, independent single mother of color, who tells the slow-to-learn time machine inventor of the rich culture of the Eloi. They don't dwell on the past, but they build massive windmill monuments to those that they have lost to the Morlocks. And of course, emotional, sweeping Lion King music is playing the whole time, and George is stunned by the ingenuity of the Eloi and the uniqueness of their colorful culture. And Weena's clever gender-bending son is full of curiosity. He wants to know everything there is to know about where George comes from. And he's a sponge for knowledge and questions everything. But before he can become George's best ever student, horns are heard off in the distance, warning of impending danger. Weena rushes off to go meet the mysterious challenge head to head, and George follows her lead. The Morlocks have come to harvest their Eloi, but these Eloi, they're not passive. They actually kind of try to escape. One by one, the Morlocks, who look like they were heavily influenced by the Lord of the Rings movies, take the Eloi and vanish underground. George tries to protect Weena and her son, but in the end, of course, it's Weena's androgynous son of color who ends up saving the stupid, hapless, colorless man from the past. The attack is now over, but Weena and many of the Eloi have been taken by the Morlocks. Something must be done. This exact same scenario plays out completely differently in the parallel universe from 1960. And not just because the filmmakers didn't have access to 3D animated Morlocks. The Eloi, you see, don't need to be violently ripped from the surface and taken below. They have been bred to be cattle. So they behave like cattle. A sound fills the air, a sound that is conspicuously identical to the sound of the air raid sirens that the people in the past were trained to respond to. The Eloi, much like their ancestors thousands of years ago, were trained to respond to the air raid sirens by obediently walking to the shelters, obediently walk to the Morlock temples, and willingly give themselves to the Morlocks. George tries to stop them, but they're in a trance. They walk like zombies or like cattle to the slaughter. Nothing he says or does seems to stop them, and they don't snap out of the trance until the doors have shut and the harvest is over. George shouts at the Eloi. He tells them they need to rise up against the Morlock and try to save their people. He tells them if they won't, he will. And with that, he finds an exhaust vent that goes into the underground layer, and he climbs down inside to fight the Morlocks and to save Weena. In the parallel universe from 2002, Weena's genius son tells George that he knows a way that he can get information on the Morlocks. He takes him to the ancient oracle, which is the AI of color that George had encountered in the library in 2030. He's still functioning, and he still has all the information ever gathered in the world. He tells them where to find the entrance to the Morlock underground lair. George, now with the wisdom that's been imparted on him, goes below and discovers, to his horror, the same thing that the 1960 parallel universe George discovers, that the Morlocks are eating the Eloi. But that's where the similarities end. 2002 George is captured by the Morlocks and taken to see the Alpha Morlock. The Alpha Morlock who couldn't be whiter, literally could not be whiter unless he was glowing. Wait, he's glowing, could not be whiter, and wouldn't you know it, he even has a person of color in a cage. The Alpha Morlock tells George in a stunning, if accidental admission that intelligence is genetic, that he was selectively bred for thousands of years for intelligence, and now has telepathic powers and controls all the other Morlocks. But also he uses his telepathic powers to keep the Eloi from fighting back. It's not their fault that they're primitive and passive. It's all the evil doings of a glowing white guy in a cave keeping them down. George kills the Alpha Morlock in an epic battle on the time machine by pushing him halfway outside the machine and then going into the future. But after the glowing white Alpha Morlock is dead, he continues into the future and he sees that the Morlocks have taken over the world. So he knows what he has to do. He goes back in time to save Weena and quickly turns the time machine into a nuclear bomb because I guess you can do that because why not? And then he rescues the other Elois and blows up the Morlock lair and saves the day. All mocking aside, the subtle implication here that is likely lost on most of the audience is that he was finally able to change the future by going back into the past. He failed to override the fate of Emma when he was trying to save his true love and have a family with her. But he was able to go back in time to save the Eloi and help Weena raise another man's child. But it wasn't because George had given up on his dream. It's that George realized he just had the wrong dream. And now the Eloi, free from the mind control of the glowing white man in the cave keeping them down, are able to live in peace and harmony in their Wakanda Ewok villages to the sounds of the Lion King soundtrack. Of course, this is not the ending that the audiences in 1960 saw. 1960 was a different time. So in this parallel universe, George finds Weena and battles the Morlocks. The Eloi, inspired by his courage, join the fight, and together they defeat the Morlocks and set the Morlock lair on fire. They feed the fires by dropping dry wood into the exhaust vents until their lair becomes a burning furnace and eventually collapses. When the smoke clears, he discovers his time machine. But before he can do anything, he's attacked by some of the remaining Morlocks and forced to go back into the past to get away. He returns to the time where the movie began, and that is when he joins his guests for the dinner to tell his tale. His story is so fantastic, his friends don't believe it. They all thank him for the entertainment, and then they take their leave. His best friend, however, David, believes George and decides to return only to find that George has gone back to the future to be with Weena. Another thing I want to add, just on the side, is this film spent a long time showing this real strong brotherhood, if you will, between George and David. And George is aware that David is going to die in World War I. And he never mentions this to David. He never says, don't go to the war, watch out, you might die. And I think this is significant, not because I think George is some kind of jerk that wants his friend to die, but that at the time there was a real sense of duty and a real sense that if you were to die in defense of your country, that it was an honorable thing. So for him to try to get David to avoid his duty as a man, it would be insulting. It would be calling David a coward to even mention it. And I think that's a completely different dynamic than what you see in movies where people go back and change things in the past, like even in Back to the Future. It's almost as if that's completely outside of the minds of these writers who don't have any sense of duty or any sense of personal responsibility. They simply want to be able to go back and cheat. They want to go back and fix mistakes that people have made. And so it's not really a super important part of this film. It's just something that I noticed, and I thought it was important to point out. But the audience isn't just left with this unfulfilling ending. Instead, they're asked a philosophical question. They're asked what they value about the civilization that their ancestors have given them. What knowledge would they want to impart to future generations? David discovers that 3 books are missing from George's bookshelf. And he asks the audience, what 3 books would they take to a civilization that needs to be rebuilt from the ashes? What knowledge from the past might help the Eloi understand how men are supposed to act? Help them understand that there's more to life than just wasting away in paradise like cattle, waiting to be harvested by the ruling class, that men help each other, form strong bonds like the friendship between George and David, strong bonds like the bonds between a man and a woman, strong bonds between all good men against oppression. What 3 books would you want to preserve? And how long until the technocratic elite of today ban them to make it easier to harvest us like cattle? For BlackPilled, I'm Devin Stack. If you like my videos, make sure you like and subscribe, and make sure you share, because the algorithm is definitely hurting us. We have to do this manually. And if you want to help support these videos, you can become a patron at patreon.com/BlackPilled, subscribe star. You can send crypto to one of the addresses below or just grab a copy of my book. The link is in the description.